Ja, wunderschönen guten Morgen hier aus Berlin. Ich sehe schon guten Morgen in den Chatfunktionen aus Bochum und aus Arnheim. Wunderschön, es ist auch wirklich ein wunderschönes Wetter im Moment in Berlin hier. Ich bin Armin Metzger, Geschäftsführer des German Testing Board, und ich freue mich sehr, Sie jetzt hier auch im Namen des Vorstands und der Mitgliedschaft des German Testing Board zum ersten GTB Testing Summit begrüßen zu können. Unser Testing Summit Slot findet also im Rahmen und in Kooperation mit dem A4Q, mit dem A4Q World Congress statt, wie Sie ja wissen. Ganz kurz GTB, German Testing Board. Wer das noch nicht kennt, wir sind das deutsche nationale Board des internationalen Verbandes ISTQB, die den Certified Tester weltweit betreuen und vertreten dieses Thema in Deutschland. Wer immer noch nicht genug weiß, der kann dann nachher an unseren virtuellen Stand auch kommen. GTB hat also sehr gerne auch die Gelegenheit wahrgenommen, im Rahmen dieses interessanten Programmes auch einen Vortragsslot aufzustellen, im Rahmen dieses innovativen virtuellen Formats auch. Und wir wollen dabei nicht in den Fokus stellen, eins dieser Standardthemen, die jetzt immer so präsentiert werden, künstliche Intelligenz oder einen ganzen Tag über Testautomatisierung, sondern uns geht es darum, den Strauß an Themen auch zu beleuchten, die im Moment halt wichtig sind. Und dazu passt dann natürlich auch wunderbar auch unser erster Vortrag. Ich würde Sie dann hinterher auch nochmal dezidiert in die Networking Area auch einladen, um dort auch den Charme dieses virtuellen Formats, das ja auch gewürzt ist mit einer Networking Area, auch kennenzulernen. Aber zuerst natürlich der Vortrag, and now I switch to English, and it's a special pleasure for me to introduce Graham Barth with his keynote, the first talk of this slot of the conference. His keynote with the title, The Next Generation Tester, Meeting the Challenges of Changing IT World. So I know Graham as a long-term colleague. Graham, how long was that? 20 years? Almost 20 years?
Too long, far too long, maybe 20 years.
Yeah, a long time, and founding member of German Testing Board. And I know him as well in German Testing Board, but also in ISTQB as one of the driving forces in this professionalization of testing skills with the certified tester. And Graham, I would not mention all the activities you have done there in the last 20 years, because then we would start your talk at 1:30 or something like that. But I'd like to mention also that he has even more decades of practical experience in software quality in his profession as a principal consultant and international trainer for T-Systems. Also, of course, contributing to major projects. So with this experience, Graham, you will show us your assessment of the current state of evolution of our technical environment and the implications for the skills, the future-proof skills, and how to evolve those skills necessary to meet those changes, those challenges. So, Graham, the virtual stage is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Armin, for those few kind words, and welcome everybody. Hope that you can understand my English okay. I live and work in Munich in Germany, and actually since about 30 years, so I can speak German, believe me, but I guess my English is better, let's put it that way. So before we start, let's just reflect a little, shall we? Where are we in IT? A lot's changed, and a lot is changing. We're seeing new technologies being introduced all the time to support IT and support businesses, new ways of working. Our testers still need to move with the times. They've been doing that for quite some time. They still need to move with the times, face those challenges, and that's the bottom line, continue to deliver value. So staying relevant is the key, And this is part of the discussion that I have for you this morning, how to keep a relevant skill set. So I think it's about time that we start talking about what I call the next generation tester. Maybe at times during the presentation, I'll call it the NG tester, the next generation tester. Let's start thinking about what we need to meet those challenges that I mentioned. And I'm going to go through some of those challenges with you. So this presentation then is going to outline some of the key business factors that influence testing. It'll look at how IT is responding to those principal influences, and it will, move into the aspect of testing. How do our testing competencies actually rise to that challenge? What I'm going to be doing is suggesting a professional development framework which is in tune with those testing competencies that we need. And just to inform you, although my background, as Armin said at the beginning, is with ISTQB and with the German Testing Board, this isn't an official ISTQB presentation. This is my view of the world, but you can probably imagine that since I'm involved with ISTQB and with the German Testing Board, those are the kinds of things that get talked about as well. So let's see what those business demands are. Well, first of all, complexity, amounts of data, and the digital revolution, what we call the Industry 4.0. That's with us and influencing IT, influencing testing. That means for business, the focus is being set on, shorter delivery cycles, more cost effectiveness, showing more flexibility, and dare I say it, agility, an ability to rapidly change. Now, quality is still in there, but the more I see projects, the more I recognize that those 4 points I just mentioned really stand out as being the major objectives. And quality, yeah, we want quality, but not at the expense of those other objectives that I just mentioned. That's something we have to come to terms with. So IT is trying to meet those demands with new technology solutions. So there's a whole lot of those technology solutions out there that are trying to match those business demands. And I don't have the whole day to walk you through all of those. Some of those stand out, those new technologies, and there are 3 here that I've picked out as being particularly relevant as I see it. And 2 of those I'm going to walk you through just to give you an example of where we are and how they impact testing. But there we have increasing levels of device connectivity, all relevant to the Internet of Things movement of mobile applications, artificial intelligence, and big data. So those are sort of just 3 of the technology solutions that meet businesses' demands. Now, it's not just all about technology. It's about also the way we work. And I think that many of you will have experienced over the years a gradual trend towards working in a more agile, perhaps even DevOps approach, more collaborative ways of working. And yes, over the last 12 months, many of us have realized the benefits of collaborative working methods. So that's one area that has impacted the way we work, but also we have the increased levels of automation. Now, we are in an automated environment. This is the way we work these days. We're faced with continuous integration. We have integrated test automation frameworks. We have modeling for test automation, MBT we call it. And we see a stronger engineering approach to the way we work. So there might be design engineering for IoT, usability engineering. These are the things that we as testers need to come to terms with. And when you look back at the technological and the way we work aspects, these things drive the way organizations such as German Testing Board think. It drives basically their approach to providing people with certification syllabi and trainings and such like that fit as closely as possible these various demands. So you will see, for example, we have model-based testing, we have test automation areas, we have usability. All of these things are available as German Testing Board, ISTQB certification trainings. So this all has an impact on our testing. So we need the ability to deal with the technology, with the complexity that it brings. We need to become more specialized, more collaborative, and more intelligent. So in terms of testing, that is. So given that trend, there's a stronger need to define how we see testers in terms of their competencies. Now, you can put a certificate on the wall, that's fine. We like that. But actually, the focus these days is far more on defining yourself in terms of your competency. What can you do for a project? And there's an example here. I can work together with developers to design automated performance tests and implement the required scripts. That's just an example of a competency. It's something that you can do and something that you can, if you like, sell to your project or your employer. So that's the impact on testing. What does this mean now for the next generation tester? Well, first of all, we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. What kind of competencies will be needed for testing? How can we shape the next generation of testers? How can they plan their future careers? And how can they help testing continue to add value, the bottom line that's been around for testing for some time? How can we keep adding value? I'm going to walk you through those 4 points on this slide to build up a picture that will hopefully address those questions. So let's start with the next generation tester. What competencies? Well, the T model is familiar to many of us. Let's start with that. It's a good place to start. And basically, it just consists of 2 elements. It has competencies or skills in a general sense. That's the blue bar across the top. And it has specialisms in the yellow column format. And those are the 2 aspects, the 2 types of competency, if you like, the broadest types of competency that we'll be looking at. So general skills now. These are what I consider to be the must-haves. These are the things that every tester must be able to do in the future. And when we go through my top 5 in a moment, 1 or 2 of you might be surprised to see some subjects in there that I now consider to be core, that are must-have general skills for a tester. Now, this isn't just my take on things or something that I thought up. This is something that I see being practiced. Part of the work that I do involves talking to apprentices and assessing whether or not they've passed their apprenticeships. That gives me a window into the worlds of these apprentices. That means I get a picture of individuals working in the workplace for particular companies, and they get to tell me how those companies work, what testing means for them, and how they're going about their daily jobs. So it's a great opportunity, not only for them, but also for me, because I can see what's being practiced. I can see what the actual general skills, the must-haves really are. So let's just talk through those top 5 general skills, the must-haves. And you will all be relieved to know that right up top is testing essentials. Yes, they are still important. So we can all relax in that sense. We don't have to throw away what we've learned before. The NG tester can practice or should be able to practice the essentials of testing in order to detect defects early. That's our principal raison d'etre for the testing world. So in particular, that means being able to do things like design tests using techniques, being able to perform exploratory testing, for example, being able to take on the various tasks within the testing process, just to mention 2 or 3 of the principal areas. So you would expect that to now be in some kind of a competency definition. And by the way, this aspect of testing essentials is relevant for developers as well. And this is something that we see continuously now, that the mix between who is testing is being spread between developers and testers. So we find developers doing more testing, and actually testers doing more developing. As a result of developers becoming more involved in the testing, in particular, of course, at the lower levels like unit testing, German Testing Board has developed a testing for developers training course syllabus, and that will be hitting the market fairly soon. So it gives you an idea of how our GTB is also responding to these essential skills that we need. So that was number 1. Number 2, knowledge of system architectures. So we're expecting the next generation tester to be able to understand different system architectures in order to understand the testing needs relating to those system architectures. So this particularly means being able to understand and analyze architectures. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to become an architect, but you need to be able to discuss with people that are doing the architectural designs, systems designers, for example. You need to be able to talk to them on their level, understand what they're talking about, and identify the risks that you need to target with your testing. And this is something that has become more and more relevant. And there's 1 or 2 examples here of typical architectures: web-based microservices, model view controller, client server. Probably we all know that. Perhaps not all of the others. We need to know all about architectures. So number 3 in our general must-have skills, effective communication. Now, I've been saying this for, well, we would say in England, donkey's years. We've been saying this for a long time, and it's taking effect. I think that people understand this. The next generation tester still needs to develop their communications skills to effectively collaborate in teams, needing to talk to stakeholders at their level. When I say stakeholders, I don't mean just their internal colleagues. Let's chat over the desk. I mean other stakeholders like product owners, managers, external organizations and clients and such like. So that particularly means we need soft skills such that we can communicate effectively with tools and methods, know how much communication is enough, know how to communicate with the right stakeholders. That's quite difficult, actually. It sounds easy, but it's quite difficult. But it's a key competency. Now, this sometimes has people scratching their heads. We're talking about general must-have competencies here. And now I'm starting to talk about test automation. Yes, test automation is becoming key. It's becoming a core competency. The next generation tester must be able to design and implement at least parts of a test automation architecture. You need to be able to understand how to use the tools. Now, there will be people that have got particular specializations in automation. I'm talking here about being able to work in an environment in which test automation is part of the regime. Now, this means for testers, we need to have programming competencies. If we can't understand what a test automation engineer is telling us, or if we can't set up some basic test automation ourselves, then we won't be able to fulfill that demand for test automation. So we need to be able to create some test automation scripts which are maintainable and efficient. I'm not saying that you have to be the number one crack test automation engineer, but you do need to be able to program at a basic level and understand automation. So we talk about these days pervasive automation. This is, automation is everywhere, and that's the reason why I consider that for my top 5 of general competencies for a tester that are must-haves. And finally, in top 5, we have the way of working in Agile and DevOps. Now, the NG tester has got to be able to work effectively in Agile and DevOps. I mentioned earlier about the people I talk to and the organizations they come from. Pretty much everybody that I speak to, and that's a lot, is doing some form of Agile or DevOps. Now, when I say some form, I'd like to emphasize that rarely do I find 2 people saying the same thing about what they consider to be Agile, what they consider to be DevOps, in particular in the Agile area. So it can be a mix between, we're doing a little bit of Agile, maybe some stand-ups, and the whole spectrum of different practices that go with Agile. So it's a broad spectrum of the way that Agile is being implemented. But the NG tester needs to have more information, more competency in being able to do his or her testing in an Agile or DevOps environment. And they need to know where testing fits into that approach. It's no good saying, I demand that testing does this, this, and this at this time. Testing has got to fit in. And the tester of tomorrow, and actually the tester of today, needs to know how to actually fit testing into an Agile approach. So many of the skills that we've just been talking about in our top 5 are enablers for that. Soft skills, programming skills, automation skills all help the NG tester to work effectively in Agile and DevOps. So that was an overview then of the big 5, I call it, general competencies. Now, let's think of specialist skills. These could be must-haves, okay? Now, I've got 3 examples there. 2 of them I'm going to show you just so that we don't overrun with time too much. 2 of them I'm just going to explain to you now, just give you a flavor. Big data, BD, and AI, artificial intelligence. And as you can see, these are the columns, if you like, of a matrix that is slowly being built up here. And the arrow indicates there can be many of these specialist skills and competencies. So let's take big data. Just quickly run through this so that we don't get stuck on the details. But big data is there to help organizations extract data and value from a huge amount of data that they're capturing. Now, that's a challenge for testing, because testing needs to come into a big data product and be able to address some of these issues, such as, how do I ensure that the performance that I'm getting out of the data analysis is good enough? In other words, the efficiency. So if I want, as a business manager, instant results from my big data application, I need to be able to test the performance. I need to be able to check that the algorithms, for example, the functional algorithms that are being used to create the big data displays and evaluations and such like, that has to be functionally correct. So those are the testing challenges. And I think the one that worries me the most, how do we ensure that things like data currency, up-to-dateness, if you like, of data, backup and recovery capabilities are working? Because big data is becoming what people call a single point of truth for our organizations. Huge decisions are being taken to actually drive and lead businesses based upon business data. So it better work. Big data, sorry. So for the NG tester, that means the following competencies. I can understand the application architectures. I can ask the right questions of stakeholders in order to understand their risks and what needs to be tested. And I can do exploratory testing sessions with business stakeholders so they can evaluate what the value is of the results that the big data applications are giving them. So that's very much down to the communication area as well as the technical area. Let's move over to AI now. AI, probably, as we're aware, is an up-and-coming aspect. What does it mean for testing? What are the challenges? Well, in AI, it means matching requests with the available knowledge base, and knowledge base is something that grows in AI. And you need to be able to, if you like, query that knowledge base. When you do that, you run the risk of so-called underfitting and overfitting. I'm not going to go into the great details of that. We don't have enough time. But underfitting means when you make a request to the knowledge base, it doesn't find anything, okay? Overfitting is the opposite. You make a request to the database, to the knowledge base, and you get tons of stuff. So it's actually about finding the right algorithms, finding the right ways to get just the information that you want out of the knowledge base. So that's a challenge, actually, for testing. You need to know about those things. So further challenge, what are the expected results? We all know from testing that we expect to have expected results. But in the context of AI, expected results are quite a tricky thing to define because they're changing, because the actual AI application itself is continuously learning. So the actual result you may get may change from day to day. So as the knowledge base grows, we have to adjust what we consider to be our expected results. So, that's just two little examples I've given you here. Note that there are specializations in there. With the general competencies that I mentioned before, the big five, I called them, you've got various things that you must have. Now you've got must-haves for an AI environment. And maybe you don't have that, so you need to build those up. Now, this is the challenge that we have in actually defining what our NG tester is going to do, because we need to actually focus on the big five general aspects, general competencies, and the necessary specializations. And it could be that AI isn't necessary for you. It could mean that it's essential for you, and it's essential for you in order to test those aspects that you can see here. Advert for our ISTQB GTB, testing AI applications coming your way soon. So an example again of how ISTQB and German Testing Board appreciate what the challenges are for the tester and provide the necessary training and syllabi to help them along their way. So that's where we are with AI. No further need to explain that. I think I mentioned it, because now we're starting to build up our structure. Now, the blue bar here is what previously I showed you as being 5 separate bars. I've just done that for organizational purposes. So those are the 5 big must-haves across the top, the blue bar, and those are the vertical yellow bars or columns that indicate the specializations. We just looked at big data and we just looked at AI. And that goes on for a long way, potentially. Okay, so there are a lot of specializations out there, huge number of them in actual fact. You could include in the specializations particular testing specialities, for example, performance testing, usability testing, or there could be business domain specialities, banking, automotive, and such like. And, you know, the NG tester, depending, and we'll come to this in a moment, needs between 0 and a large number of specialist skills. So now we've looked at the general competencies. We've got a taste of what I mean by the specialist competencies. I think we need to just build up now the big picture of what we're leading to. Okay, these are our general competencies. These are our specialist competencies. I think we need to add to the way we look at things a certain level of, if you like, difficulty, progression, if you like, levels, where we see that some of those competencies that we've been looking at, you can define as being at an essential level, an advanced level, or perhaps a higher consulting type of level. So whether you have 3 blocks there in the way you consider the levels of difficulty, or whether you have something that you define for yourself, it doesn't matter. The main thing is you realize that for each general and each specialist competency, you can define a particular level of difficulty. So it's a continuum. Now, I'm adding to the big picture here, and this needs a bit of explanation. What we end up is with an overall competency framework. Is that we're building this framework up, and it's going to actually be sufficient that we can later use that as an overall competency framework. What's in it? Well, we've just been building it up, so it doesn't come as any surprise to see that we've got the general and the specialist competencies. So your framework, your overall framework, will contain descriptions of all the generic or general competencies at different levels, and all the specialist competencies at the different levels. So you've got a block there of 6. That's a lot of stuff, okay? But what I'm suggesting is that we need this kind of overall competency framework. To go with it, we need to have criteria for achievement. In other words, how do I show that I've acquired all the general competencies at essentials level? Okay, the top left in the matrix. That kind of criteria needs to be built into our framework. In addition, we need to be considering how to assess these things. An assessment model. Now, we all know about certificates, but actually we also need in our model a way of perhaps using practical evidence to assess whether you've achieved particular advanced competencies. If you're looking at the consulting level, it could be that your assessment model says practical assessments are required. So this is the kind of framework, competency framework model that needs to be slowly but surely built up. Now, that's quite a lot to take in. So I just want to step back a little bit and just sort of talk you through the steps that you would go through to apply this overall competency framework. So 3 steps, basically. Defining what your NG tester is going to be for the future. Establishing where you are at the moment with your competencies and the staff that you have, perhaps, and filling the gaps. Let's take these steps one by one. That's the picture that we had before, but I've added, again, more detail to it. So let's take this slowly. This is about defining your next generation tester using the overall competency framework. And the overall competency framework is the top half of this slide. There we have our general and specialist competencies at the 3 levels, making our 6 blocks. And the overall competency framework is actually something that I'm suggesting should be defined by industry, by the testing industry. It should be some form, I don't want to go too far by saying there should be a standard for it, but that a kind of a standard, a body of knowledge, a body of competency descriptions, a full and complete framework that can be used. And I'm suggesting, for example, industry organizations, ISO, BCS, ISTQB, they should all be actually considering these things, okay? Setting up this kind of competency framework. The idea being that you in your organization, or maybe even your project, if it's a large project, use that framework in order to define what your NG tester needs to have in the way of competencies. Okay, so you would probably be hopefully saying, well, they need to have all of the essentials in the general competencies. That's the starting area. But you need to also look at your projects, look at your organizations. What kind of applications do we have? Are they AI applications, and so on? And define for yourselves what those particular specialist competencies should be based upon what you see in the overall framework. Okay, so it's like it's tailoring the general competency framework for the purposes of your organization and your project. Once you have that, you've got the ability to consistently define what the NG tester means for you in your organization. I think that that's pretty important because, to be honest with you, it's really difficult to define a single definition of what a tester needs to do. It's very often different, and this is what the concept that I've got on this slide actually enables you to achieve. So we're going to add now for the next step, establish where you are, our friends from the criteria for achievement and the assessment model. This is what I showed you before. You are going to be actually taking the framework, creating your own competency framework based on that, and as the next step, asking yourself, well, that's what we want, how far have we come? And that requires that we have some form of being able to assess people's competencies at the different levels of essentials, advanced, and consulting. And that we've got particular criteria there on which we can base those assessments. So that's where we need to get to. And I think that the overall style is going to be much more flexible kind of approach than what we've perhaps been used to. And this is the reason why, for example, that ISTQB is investing a lot of money and time in developing these specialist areas. They are the areas where people perhaps are not so aware of what the competencies need to be. And I think that the first steps have been taken by ISTQB towards specialist areas. I would like to say that I'm the specialist working group at ISTQB, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But that is one of the key things that I feel that the organisations such as GTB and ISTQB need to be attending to. So that was step 2, filling the gaps. Well, you've used your assessment model, you've looked at your criteria, you've decided what competencies you actually need in terms of specialists. And now it's just a task of actually saying, okay, we can now see the gap. We can now see where we actually need to improve our competencies in testing. And that enables you to create a skills improvement plan, perhaps for the organization, perhaps for individuals, but the actual improvement plan that you generate is going to be objective, it's going to be consistent, it's going to be based upon, if you like, an understood overall framework. And I think that provides a lot of organizations and perhaps even individuals with a perspective. It shows them, what is it that I need to achieve? What are the things that I need to focus on? What are the things where perhaps I need extra training? So that's where organizations such as BCS, ISTQB, A4Q, and so on come into play. They are addressing that gap. So going forward, occurred to me the other day that actually it's not a straight long road that goes in one direction. Lovely picture, isn't it? But actually going forward, it's much more of a twisty and turny old road, to be honest with you. But it is going forwards, and just like to wrap up so that we've got time for 1 or 2 questions, sort of like summarize for you some of the key messages to take us, if you like, along that road. So these are the key messages for the NG tester. Testing competencies are becoming more varied. Okay? Don't panic. I didn't say that, but don't panic. Our existing skills will still be useful. What you learned before can still be used now, but we need to add to those skills. An overall competency framework, such as the one that I've outlined to you, would be of immense help. It can describe for you the general skills. You can call them the top 5 if you like. Perhaps other organizations might want to define 3 or 6, doesn't matter. You need to think about what the general must-have skills will be. And you need to think about what kind of specialist skills would we be expecting from a tester in the future. And that's going to be where you define lots and lots of individual specialist skills from which you choose for your particular organization. So levels of achievement are important so that you can show a progression, so that you can give people a way of saying, well, this is where you start and this is what you could progress to. This is the approach that ISTQB takes. And we need a way of evaluating achievement. And that is an area where, at the moment, the evaluation of achievement is based principally upon an exam, a multiple choice exam that enables you to get a certificate. Now that's good, but it's only a start. And in order to make our competency framework useful for the future, the overall competency framework needs some way of evaluating achievement. It needs some criteria. It needs different methods of evaluating achievement. And I guess that's the area where ISTQB, GTB should be putting quite a bit of effort. And that's what they actually are doing at the moment. But this is continuing along that road towards developing this kind of overall competency framework. Okay, so key message, use the framework. Use it to define the NG tester competencies that suit your purpose. Use it as a reference for anyone involved in skills training. So any of you out there that are listening, that training providers, for example, you should be making yourself familiar with these competency frameworks as they start to become available. Well, that's it. That gives us 10 to 15 minutes of time to handle any questions that you might have. I hope that information that I've given you is going to be useful for you. I've in the past talked about this kind of thing before, and people come rushing up to me afterwards and say, can we have your overall competency framework? I would love to show that to you. I would love to give that to you, but it's something that still needs to be actually put together. We have the building blocks for it, but we don't yet have the actual overall concept. So when you're asking me a question, can I have your framework? No, you can't, because it's not there yet. We've just got the building blocks. However, I'll pass over now to Armin, who may have some questions you want to ask, or we can meet in the chat room later on if you so desire. Thanks for listening so far, and let me know how you get on, please.
So before we come to the questions, Graham, I'd first like to thank you for this talk that I think is a perfect introduction, and in the comments it was written inspiring. That's true for the whole further conference. And I'd like to mention explicitly that we have this networking area that's it makes fun to enter there. Try that, where Graham will be present in the GTB lounge at some virtual table for some question and answers and a little bit more discussions afterwards. So I think now it's time to come to some questions. So please issue your questions in the chat functionality. In the meantime, during the talk, there was one question by Petra Schneider. I think it's already answered by the whole talk. What are the special challenges between the core competencies of today's and future testers? Maybe you sum up that, Graham, in a few words.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, it's what I was alluding to in the presentation. What are they? I can answer that in the presentation quite clearly for the general must-have, so sort of the top 5. For the specialists, which ones do I need? You have to decide that. It's up to the overall framework to define what the specialities can be, such that you as a organization or training organization or whatever organization you come from, so that you can pick the ones that you need for defining your own, if you want to call it, blend of NG tester. And this is what gives you the flexibility. I do think that we've done a great job, if I may pat ourselves on the back at ISTQB and GTB, in defining and putting the role of the tester out there. This was not really available some years ago, and that's what we've been able to do. We've defined and focused on what the tester does. But I do think that we need to introduce more flexibility into that kind of concept by saying, look, these days with all of these different challenges, with all these different specializations, we really need to have the flexibility to define what we think in our organization is the NG tester that we need. Hopefully that answered your question. It was a lot. Started to give the presentation once again, if I'm not careful, but I hope that addressed the key part of your question.
Okay, so thank you. There's one further question. In the meantime, it's Michael Gumbrecht. This is quite a tricky question for you, Graham, especially for you. Is the test manager still valuable or too general with his knowledge?
Well, if you're looking at I've been looking at the NG tester as opposed to the NG test manager. However, you could define, if you like, an extension of that framework to cover specific test management aspects. And I think that you will see quite a bit of overlap, in actual fact, between what I've been talking about and what the test manager would need. In particular, I would say that the test manager really needs to be looking at some of those broader must-have competencies, in particular in the area of soft skills, testing in general, the testing essentials. And I can imagine that if you were to focus on the next generation test manager, that you would add certain key competencies that you know, straight off the bat, I would say one of the key competencies that you would need is able to manage a project. Okay, fundamentally. Okay, so you might see that as being an additional must-have general competency directed specifically at test managers. But I've tried to keep things a little bit more flexible than that, because, you know, what's a test manager these days? Even the definition there is becoming very diffuse, depending upon the type of project you're working in, and in particular the type of application, the type of approach that you're using. So if you're using an agile approach, it could well be that you don't actually even have a test manager as such, but you do have people that have got test management competencies. And so taking that point on in your question, I think that perhaps if I were to do a version 2 of the next generation tester, it would be the next generation tester stroke test manager. And then we could consider some of the specific skills of a test manager in there.
Perfect, thanks. So maybe a final question by Gerhard Wistuba. I think that also is some kind of summing up what you presented. He asked since he was asked by a young student what a typical career path it would be for a software tester, where to start, what studies, what training.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of like a big question, right? And that I'll try and answer that briefly, because I could spend a couple of hours on that. First of all, ISTQB is looking at the concept of career paths. At the moment, we have a core area of ISTQB that takes you from foundations to advanced to what they call expert. That is a path. But if you want my opinion, these paths are becoming far more flexible. There are multiple paths that you can define. And those paths are defined by what the needs are of industry and what the needs are of your organization and projects. If you've got an overall framework that defines the competencies, in my opinion, you should be able to then define the path that you take to achieving the competencies that you need. And that is the approach that I would say is going to be much more flexible for us to apply in the future. It still means that we can have our courses, certification courses, and such like. But I think that we need far more flexibility, and there won't be a single career path to follow. I think that there will be multiple paths, and actually, I think to a certain extent that's a good thing, to let people be able to see what they need to do and decide for themselves what kind of a career path they want. Or let's say at least their organization's HR department or whatever can decide what their career paths will be based upon the needs, based upon the competencies that are needed to address those needs.
Okay, so thanks. Maybe a brief answer to the last question I have here from Peter Schneider again. How do you look at the probably expected switch from standards, fixed processes, and controlling to more E2E quality creating support for testers?
Wow. That's almost impossible to answer. I mean, the E2E aspect is if you like, intrinsic in this overall framework. It's just the career paths. It's a question of career paths again. I think a little bit. The E2E is you start. Well, I think that you can define the start quite easily. You can define that as being, look, we've got our must-have skills and competencies at the essentials level, at our beginner level. I think that's the start point for pretty much everything. Where you go to, what the journey is, your E2E journey, is what you decide. The framework helps you to decide which path you want to take. Now, there are some aspects where ISTQB helps you, you could argue forces you to take a particular path. You can't take particular specialist subjects or particular advanced subjects until you've got foundations. So that's sort of like helping you along a path, if you like. But I do think that ultimately it's going to be up to the organization to look at this kind of overall framework, which should be supported by a body of knowledge, such that they can actually see what the options are that are open to them and define their own E2E. I'm hoping that actually addresses the key aspect of the question. It's kind of a difficult one to answer, but maybe I can pick up on that later in the chat if that's an idea.
And that's perfect last words, so to say. To again, thank you, Graham, and of course the offer to discuss those topics also a little bit in detail now for the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes in the speaker's corner in the networking area, where I would like to invite you very much.
Thank you. It's going to be an exciting thing to do. So let's hope the technology is good for that. And let's do that. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. I hope this has given you some food for thought. Hope this has given you, if you like, a background that gives you, let's say, a platform from which you can go onwards through the day, through the various presentations, which I'm sure are going to be excellent. And maybe you just might find yourself saying, oh, where would that fit into an overall competency framework? Thanks for listening, everybody, and goodbye from Munich.
Yeah, thank you, and see you in the networking area.
Okay,
Bye.
bye now.